Willard Van Orman Quine. Willard Van Orman Quine, /Quine/, known to intimates as Van, June 25, 1908, December 25, 2000, was an American philosopher and logician in the analytic tradition, recognized as one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. From 1930 until his death 70 years later, Quine was continually affiliated with Harvard University in one way or another, first as a student, then as a professor of philosophy and a teacher of logic and set theory, and finally as a professor emeritus who published or revised several books in retirement. He filled the Edgar Pierce Chair of Philosophy at Harvard from 1956 to 1978. A 2009 poll conducted among analytic philosophers named Quine as the fifth most important philosopher of the past 2 centuries. He won the first Schock Prize in Logic and Philosophy in 1993 for his systematical and penetrating discussions of how learning of language and communication are based on socially available evidence and of the consequences of this for theories on knowledge and linguistic meaning. In 1996 he was awarded the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy for his outstanding contributions to the progress of philosophy in the 20th century by proposing numerous theories based on keen insights in logic, epistemology, philosophy of science and philosophy of language. Quine falls squarely into the analytic philosophy tradition while also being the main proponent of the view that philosophy is not conceptual analysis but the abstract branch of the empirical sciences. His major writings include Two Dogmas of Empiricism, 1951, which attacked the traditional analytic synthetic distinction between propositions and advocated a form of semantic holism, and Word and Object, 1960, which further developed these positions and introduced Quine's famous indeterminacy of translation thesis, advocating a behaviorist theory of meaning. He also developed an influential naturalized epistemology that tried to provide an improved scientific explanation of how we have developed elaborate scientific theories on the basis of meager sensory input. He is also important in philosophy of science for his systematic attempt to understand science from within the resources of science itself and for his conception of philosophy as continuous with science. This led to his famous quip that philosophy of science is philosophy enough. In philosophy of mathematics, he and his Harvard colleague Hilary Putnam developed the Quine-Putnam indispensability thesis, an argument for the reality of mathematical entities. Biography. According to his autobiography, The Time of My Life, 1986, Quine grew up in Akron, Ohio, where he lived with his parents and older brother Robert Cloyd. His father, Cloyd Robert, was a manufacturing entrepreneur, founder of the Akron Equipment Company, which produced tire molds, and his mother, Harriet E., was a school teacher and later a housewife. He received his BA in mathematics from Oberlin College in 1930, and his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University in 1932. His thesis supervisor was Alfred North Whitehead. He was then appointed a Harvard Junior Fellow, which excused him from having to teach for 4 years. During the academic year 1932-33, he traveled in Europe thanks to a Sheldon Fellowship, meeting Polish logicians, including Stanislaw Lesniewski and Alfred Tarski, and members of the Vienna Circle, including Rudolf Carnap, as well as the logical positivist A.J. Ayer. It was Quine who arranged for Tarski to be invited to the September 1939 Unity of Science Congress in Cambridge, for which Tarski sailed on the last ship to leave Danzig before the Third Reich invaded Poland. Tarski survived the war and worked another 44 years in the U.S. During World War II, Quine lectured on logic in Brazil, in Portuguese, and served in the United States Navy in a military intelligence role, deciphering messages from German submarines, and reaching the rank of lieutenant commander. At Harvard, Quine helped supervise the Harvard graduate theses of, among others, David Lewis, Daniel Dennett, Gilbert Harman, Dagfinn Falstall, Hao Wang, Hugues Leblanc, Henry His and George Miro. For the academic year 1964 to 1965, Quine was a fellow on the faculty in the Center for Advanced Studies at Wesleyan University. In 1980, Quine received an honorary doctorate from the Faculty of Humanities at Uppsala University, Sweden. Quine was an atheist when he was a teenager. He had 4 children by 2 marriages. Guitarist Robert Quine was his nephew. In the foreword to the new edition of Word and Object, Quine's student Dagfinn Falstall noted that Quine began to lose his memory toward the end of his life. The deterioration of his short-term memory was so severe that he struggled to continue following arguments. Quine also had considerable difficulty in his project to make the desired revisions to Word and Object. Before passing away, Quine noted to Morton White, "I do not remember what my illness is called, Althusser or Alzheimer, but since I cannot remember it, it must be Alzheimer." He died from the illness on Christmas Day in 2000. Political beliefs. Quine was politically conservative, but the bulk of his writing was in technical areas of philosophy removed from direct political issues. He did, however, write in defense of several conservative positions. For example, in Quiddities, an intermittently philosophical dictionary, he wrote a defense of moral censorship, while, in his autobiography, he made some criticisms of American post-war academic culture. Work. Quine's PhD thesis and early publications were on formal logic and set theory. Only after World War II did he, by virtue of seminal papers on ontology, epistemology and language, emerge as a major philosopher. By the 1960s, he had worked out his naturalized epistemology, whose aim was to answer all substantive questions of knowledge and meaning using the methods and tools of the natural sciences. Quine roundly rejected the notion that there should be a first philosophy, a theoretical standpoint somehow prior to natural science and capable of justifying it. These views are intrinsic to his naturalism. Quine could lecture in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and German, as well as his native English. Like the logical positivists, Quine evinced little interest in the philosophical canon. Only once did he teach a course in the history of philosophy, on David Hume. Rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction. In the 1930s and 40s, discussions with Rudolf Carnap, Nelson Goodman, and Alfred Tarski, among others, led Quine to doubt the tenability of the distinction between analytic statements, those true simply by the meanings of their words, such as all bachelors are unmarried, and synthetic statements, those true or false by virtue of facts about the world, such as there is a cat on the mat. This distinction was central to logical positivism. Although Quine is not normally associated with verificationism, some philosophers believe the tenet is not incompatible with his general philosophy of language, citing his Harvard colleague B.F. Skinner in his analysis of language and verbal behavior. Like other analytic philosophers before him, Quine accepted the definition of analytic as true in virtue of meaning alone. Unlike them, however, he concluded that ultimately the definition was circular. In other words, Quine accepted that analytic statements are those that are true by definition, then argued that the notion of truth by definition was unsatisfactory. Quine's chief objection to analyticity is with the notion of synonymy, sameness of meaning, a sentence being analytic, just in case it substitutes a synonym for one black in a proposition like all black things are black, or any other logical truth. The objection to synonymy hinges upon the problem of collateral information. We intuitively feel that there is a distinction between all unmarried men are bachelors and there have been black dogs, but a competent English speaker will assent to both sentences under all conditions, since such speakers also have access to collateral information bearing on the historical existence of black dogs. Quine maintains that there is no distinction between universally known collateral information and conceptual or analytic truths. Another approach to Quine's objection to analyticity and synonymy emerges from the modal notion of logical possibility. A traditional Wittgensteinian view of meaning held that each meaningful sentence was associated with a region in the logical space, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus 1.13. Quine finds the notion of such a space problematic, arguing that there is no distinction between those truths which are universally and confidently believed and those which are necessarily true. Confirmationhoism and ontological relativity. The central theses underlying the indeterminacy of translation and other extensions of Quine's work are ontological relativity and the related doctrine of confirmationhoism. The premise of confirmationhoism is that all theories, and the propositions derived from them, are underdetermined by empirical data, sensory data, evidence, although some theories are not justifiable, failing to fit with the data or being unworkably complex, there are many equally justifiable alternatives. While the Greeks' assumption that unobservable, Homeric gods exist is false, and our supposition of unobservable, electromagnetic waves is true, both are to be justified solely by their ability to explain our observations. Quine concluded his two dogmas of empiricism as follows. Quine's ontological relativism, evident in the passage above, led him to agree with Pierre Duhem that for any collection of empirical evidence, there would always be many theories able to account for it. However, Duhem's holism is much more restricted and limited than Quine's. For Duhem, underdetermination applies only to physics or possibly to natural science, while for Quine it applies to all of human knowledge. Thus, While it is possible to verify or falsify whole theories, it is not possible to verify or falsify individual statements. Almost any particular statement can be saved, given sufficiently radical modifications of the containing theory. For Quine, scientific thought forms a coherent web in which any part could be altered in the light of empirical evidence, and in which no empirical evidence could force the revision of a given part. Existence and its contrary. The problem of non-referring names is an old puzzle in philosophy, which Quine captured when he wrote. More directly, the controversy goes. Quine resists the temptation to say that non-referring terms are meaningless for reasons made clear above. Instead, he tells us that we must first determine whether our terms refer or not before we know the proper way to understand them. However, Czesław Lejewski criticizes this belief for reducing the matter to empirical discovery when it seems we should have a formal distinction between referring and non-referring terms or elements of our domain. Lejewski writes further. Lejewski then goes on to offer a description of free logic, which he claims accommodates an answer to the problem. Lejewski also points out that free logic additionally can handle the problem of the empty set for statements like xfx display style for all x comma fx right arrow exists x comma fx. Quine had considered the problem of the empty set unrealistic, which left Lejewski unsatisfied. Logic. Over the course of his career, Quine published numerous technical and expository papers on formal logic, some of which are reprinted in his Selected Logic Papers and in The Ways of Paradox. Quine confined logic to classical bivalent first-order logic, hence to truth and falsity under any non-empty universe of discourse. Hence the following were not logic for Quine. Quine wrote 3 undergraduate texts on formal logic. Mathematical logic is based on Quine's graduate teaching during the 1930s and 40s. It shows that much of what Principia Mathematica took more than 1,000 pages to say can be said in 250 pages. The proofs are concise, even cryptic. The last chapter, on Gödel's incompleteness theorem and Tarski's indefinability theorem, along with the article Quine, 1946, became a launching point for Raymond Smullian's later lucid exposition of these and related results. Quine's work in logic gradually became dated in some respects. Techniques he did not teach and discuss include analytic tableaus, recursive functions, and model theory. His treatment of metalogic left something to be desired. For example, mathematical logic does not include any proofs of soundness and completeness. Early in his career, the notation of his writings on logic was often idiosyncratic. His later writings nearly always employed the now dated notation of Principia Mathematica. Set against all this are the simplicity of his preferred method, as exposited in his Methods of Logic, for determining the satisfiability of quantified formulas, the richness of his philosophical and linguistic insights, and the fine prose in which he expressed them. Most of Quine's original work in formal logic from 1960 onwards was on variants of his predicate functor logic, one of several ways that have been proposed for doing logic without quantifiers. For a comprehensive treatment of predicate functor logic and its history, see Quine, 1976. For an introduction, see CHPT 45 of his Methods of Logic. Quine was very warm to the possibility that formal logic would eventually be applied outside of philosophy and mathematics. He wrote several papers on the sort of Boolean algebra employed in electrical engineering, and with Edward J. McCluskey, devised the Quine-McCluskey algorithm of reducing Boolean equations to a minimum covering sum of prime implicants. Set theory. While his contributions to logic include elegant expositions and a number of technical results, it is in set theory that Quine was most innovative. He always maintained that mathematics required set theory and that set theory was quite distinct from logic. He flirted with Nelson Goodman's nominalism for a while, but backed away when he failed to find a nominalist grounding of mathematics. Over the course of his career, Quine proposed 3 variants of axiomatic set theory, each including the axiom of extensionality. All 3 set theories admit a universal class, but since they are free of any hierarchy of types, they have no need for a distinct universal class at each type level. Quine's set theory and its background logic were driven by a desire to minimize posits. Each innovation is pushed as far as it can be pushed before further innovations are introduced. For Quine, there is but one connective, the Sheffer stroke, and one quantifier, the universal quantifier. All polyadic predicates can be reduced to one dyadic predicate, interpretable as set membership. His rules of proof were limited to modus ponens and substitution. He preferred conjunction to either disjunction or the conditional, because conjunction has the least semantic ambiguity. He was delighted to discover early in his career that all of first-order logic and set theory could be grounded in a mere two primitive notions, abstraction and inclusion. For an elegant introduction to the parsimony of Quine's approach to logic, see his New Foundations for Mathematical Logic, ch. 5, and his From a Logical Point of View. Epistemology. Just as he challenged the dominant analytic synthetic distinction, Quine also took aim at traditional normative epistemology. According to Quine, traditional epistemology tried to justify the sciences, but this effort, as exemplified by Rudolf Carnap, failed, and so we should replace traditional epistemology with an empirical study of what sensory inputs produce what theoretical outputs. Epistemology, or something like it, simply falls into place as a chapter of psychology and hence of natural science. It studies a natural phenomenon, viz., a physical human subject. This human subject is accorded a certain experimentally controlled input, certain patterns of irradiation in assorted frequencies, for instance, and in the fullness of time the subject delivers as output a description of the three-dimensional external world and its history. The relation between the meager input and the torrential output is a relation that we are prompted to study for somewhat the same reasons that always prompted epistemology, namely, in order to see how evidence relates to theory, and in what ways one's theory of nature transcends any available evidence. But a conspicuous difference between old epistemology and the epistemological enterprise in this new psychological setting is that we can now make free use of empirical psychology. Quine, 1969, 82-3. Quine's proposal is controversial among contemporary philosophers and has several critics, with Willard Quine the most prominent among them. In popular culture. Bibliography. Selected books. Important articles. Filmography. Important articles. Filmography. Important articles.